Looks like there's still a few people joining. Hi, everyone. My name is Dylan Romero. We'll be starting shortly. It looks like we still have a few people joining. All right. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our training event on depression, addiction, and suicide. My name is Dylan Romero, and I am the Referral Relations Specialist for Recovery Ways in Montana. I have worked in the behavioral healthcare field for the last 7 years, while also being in recovery myself. I've worked for a few programs in my past, and Recovery Ways has felt like home since I was hired. During the webinar, I'd like to make everybody aware of a few things. Firstly, you will notice your reactions tab at the bottom toolbar. Please be aware, of the reactions tab on the bottom toolbar, excuse me. Be aware, for those of you seeking CEU credits, an automatic survey will pop up with a questionnaire for you to receive those credits. An automatic email will also be scheduled to go out with the link to the survey and a link to the PowerPoint if it's available. Recovery Ways is a program offering all levels of care for substance abuse and mental health. In those levels of care, we cover everything from detox, residential, outpatient, with virtual and in-person options. We cater to all demographics, including first responders, union members, and EAP members, and veterans. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today, Jaime Vinck. Jaime was recruited in 2020 to oversee the strategic expansion and integration of Recovery Ways in other markets. In her role, Jaime provided leadership to the operations in Salt Lake City, Utah, Spokane, Washington, Arlington, Washington, Las Vegas, Nevada, Boise, Idaho, Houston, Texas, and Austin, Texas. During her time at Recovery Ways, Jaime has worked with her team to create a one-of-a-kind in-network standalone primary mental health program and created the Recovery Ways family of programs, which includes Omega Recovery and Omega Recovery Tech and Screen Addiction Program. Jaime was previously the CEO of Sierra Tucson Group, where she created and led the rebranding of Sierra by the Sea and Sunrise Ranch, as well as oversaw the Sierra Tucson campus, where she held a number of leadership roles. An industry advocate, Jaime serves as a treasurer on the executive committee of the board of directors of the National Association of Addiction Treatment Providers. She speaks nationally and internationally on trending topics, including suicide, trauma-informed leadership, and compassion, fatigue, and provider resilience. Please join me in welcoming Jaime Vinck.
Thanks, Dylan. Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. So this topic of ours this morning, suicide, addiction, and depression, it's obviously a very relevant topic. It's a very heavy topic. And for me, it's something that's very near and dear to my heart. I've been in this business for many years, and on the treatment side, primarily on the residential side. I'm a licensed professional counselor in the state of Arizona and have had every job you can imagine in a residential treatment center. I've always been intrigued by the level of suicidality that we see in folks that are struggling with addiction and folks that are in early recovery. So I've made it my mission, lo these many years, to study this, to understand it, and to work hard to be of service in uncovering some trends and really building the confidence in treatment centers so that folks can responsibly treat suicidal ideation, suicidal attempts, those kinds of things. And it's been a journey that began before COVID. And it was something that our nation was in a bit of a suicide epidemic. So I started to do these talks and found so many therapists were saying, thank you. You know, this is something that we don't often talk about. And ever since COVID, it has been, it's been everywhere. And it's so important as clinicians that we understand and that we also have new tools and have the best research. So that's what today's about. The other thing, in full disclosure, is the best way to understand suicide, to work with suicide survivors is through lived experience. And I can tell you honestly that I have struggled with suicidal ideations on and off since I was 13 years old. Some of you might be out there saying, ouch, lady, that's an overshare. And others of you might say, awesome, yeah, me too. And so if it helps one of you for me to stand up here and own what I live with daily, then good. But so this is a labor of love for me. And that's the why behind today. All right, so let's look at these wonderful folks and think a bit about what they have in common. And unfortunately, I added one just this morning. T Witch Boss. I can't say it's anyone that I'm familiar with myself, but I know that for people that are perhaps in a different demographic than I am in terms of age, that he's someone that's very meaningful, and he's also someone that's perceived as having it all. So if we look at the folks on this screen, and we're going to dive in to each one of their stories and how their suicide perhaps unfolded, the legacy that they leave, and also what it means to our topic today as clinicians, some things that we can learn by their horrible tragedies. So these are folks that we're going to be talking about today and learning a bit from them. All right. So we are in a mental health crisis. I don't know that that's a big shock or revelation to anyone. And as I mentioned, this was something that I was studying even before COVID. And we're still pretty consistent at between 47,000 and 49,000 deaths by suicide annually. It's becoming increasingly common for kids aged 10 to 34, our young adults. There's fear that folks are seeing that as an option as we weigh through our options, that suicide is becoming more prevalent and more something that is entertained. It's the fourth leading cause of death for adults 35 to 54. And some new data that's come out since COVID that is just staggering to me is that in 2021, the CDC reported that there were 1.4 million suicide attempts and 3 million adults report suicidal thoughts. Think about that for a sec. I wish I could tell you, and as my bio stated, we at Recovery Ways, we've stood up a primary mental health program, largely in response to these numbers. I have a history of working with primary mental health, and in the centers where I've worked, this is something that I've been devoted to, is to understanding what's happening to the 1.4 million people that are making suicide attempts. I would like to think that they're all warm in the bosom of these wonderful treatment centers, but that's not true. I have had employees make a suicide attempt and come to work the next day with rope marks on their neck. People are not getting treatment. Part of the reason is they don't know how. It's not being covered. And now I'm getting into a rant that will be later, but it's just mind-blowing to me that these folks are all out there in our midst, and we got to find a way to help. Here's another staggering statistic. There's one suicide for 4 attempts in the elderly. And elderly is considered, for purposes of this discussion, age 65 and older. There's a number of reasons for that, and we'll talk about that as we move through this. So every death by suicide leaves behind 130 people who knew the person, and between 4 and 6 who said they loved them. With our 1.4 million attempts and 3 million suicidal thoughts, we have a generation, we have a world of what I've come to call the walking wounded. And these are folks that either have attempts themselves, have dark thoughts themselves, or they've lost someone that they really care about to suicide. We've spent the last 1.5 to 2 years helping our employer partners. You know, there's a lot of folks in the unions that we treat, in the airlines that were our referral partners, where employees are dying by suicide, and they're dying by suicide in their places of work, and they're being discovered by their coworkers. And so it's shattering our workplaces, and particularly our safety sensitive roles. And so my colleagues and I have been going into airports, into engine rooms, into hangars, into all of the people that keep us safely flying in the air, and lending support due to all of the suicides that are occurring in a number of places. And so something to be aware of too, as we think through suicides, is the contagion and cluster effect. The research does show that contagions and clusters are real, and it's something to be mindful of. And part of the reason that this happens is that vulnerable adults see other people, and especially those in prominent positions. If they die by suicide, a vulnerable adult might say, that becomes a reasonable alternative. And what ends up happening is that when there are suicides that get irresponsible coverage in the media, we see a rise in that demographic, as well as the type of suicide that occurs, the method used. And so it's really important that we be mindful of contagions and clusters in our workplaces, and also in treatment centers and wherever else a group exists. So what's so complicated? I know I started out talking about the relationship between depression, substance abuse, and suicide. So this becomes one of those, what comes first? Do we use substances to cope with symptoms of our depression, or do we become increasingly depressed because we all know in substance use disorder, as it escalates, the wreckage, the damage that's created to one's life and to one's supports becomes a reality. So we also need to look at substances, alcohol, opioids, and we know that alcohol use throughout the pandemic has escalated between 40 and 50%, especially in women, in alcohol-related deaths. And so we know that alcohol, opioids, they're central nervous system depressants. And so people can really make very poor decisions while under the influence of these substances. The other thing that is important to look at as we think through these are the other behavioral traits that are oftentimes exacerbated when someone is under the influence or, interestingly enough, in early recovery. So what do I mean by some of these traits? So we're going to think about behavioral traits: aggression, impulsivity, hopelessness, lack of social supports. The research shows us that people that are depressed, people that have alcoholism, have higher suicidal ideation, have more conflict in these areas, and are at greater risk. The other thing that we look at is environmental factors: relationship disruption, financial losses, loss of employment, and of course, childhood trauma are things that play an extremely key role in suicidal ideation. And we're going to look at the most recent research behind all of this. So these are things that also happen with those that are struggling with a substance use disorder. And so let's talk a bit about the primal humiliation piece. And this is something that I learned not too long ago when studying all of this. And what we find is that if someone suffers a humiliation, and it's called a primal humiliation, which is something that occurs that challenges your essence of being, your identity, and it's often something that's public. And these are famous figure skaters, equestrian gold medalists, and they both had accusations of inappropriate behavior, and each of them died within 30 days by suicide. They did not have any history of suicidal ideation, depression, any of those kinds of things. We recently, I don't know if any of you saw this in the media last month, it was probably 2-3 weeks ago, where a high school principal died by suicide at Disneyland. He jumped off one of the parking structures. He had been accused of domestic violence, and it was something that was career ending. And so he was, he died by suicide and left a very tragic email behind explaining it. This becomes extremely relevant with social media and the cyberbullying and the things that go on. So when I talk about humiliation and primal humiliation, it's done with the impact of saying, if we know something like this is occurring, if we're in an organization where we know that there's a very serious accusation, then wraparound services are so important. When I looked at this, the note that this gentleman left, the high school principal, I thought, oh my gosh, we get to wrap around and to support these folks. And, you know, when I've done this presentation live so many times and I get challenged on this, because both the folks that I've got up on the screen they were accused of some heinous things. And you know what? Okay, but the word is accused. We didn't know. And to have the wraparound services when something like this occurs is so important. So primal humiliation is something I'm going to ask you all to think about. So when we talk about substance use disorder, we know that there's big gender differences. So males outnumber females in suicide 4-1. However, the association of suicide and substance use disorder in women is markedly stronger. It's also interesting that mortality rates for women with alcohol use disorder are 17 times higher than men with alcohol use disorder. The other thing that's interesting to me about this is that we have alcohol use disorder. You know, there's a real increase in death. I don't know how many of you have recently seen the studies that alcohol-related deaths are rising in the causes of death with adults. And an alcohol-related death could be a number of things: liver disease, kidney disease. It could also be driving with a DUI and mortality, those kinds of things. The important thing to note is that when we have someone that's behaving recklessly in their substance use disorder, to look at their intentions and to challenge the notion of a slow suicide. Is this something that their life is becoming a walking suicide? And to educate them on alcohol. And we're going to talk more about that as we look at alcohol use disorder and some of the most recent research. So we know that acute alcohol intoxication is real, it's rising, and there are certain risk factors with alcohol use disorder, including relationship disruption and males and the age. So these are risk factors that we get to understand. And we know that when one is drinking, regardless of the fact that they could be diagnosed as someone with alcohol use disorder or not, alcohol lowers inhibitions. And the weight of their decision, the weight of their actions is something that is not necessarily top of mind. There's some new research out that alcohol is viewed as a significant catalyst for suicide because, as I mentioned, it decreases one's inhibitions and it increases your depressed mood. So what can happen while one is intoxicated is increased psychological distress, increased aggressiveness, and it can propel one's suicidal ideation and suicide-specific alcohol expectancies. For example, it can provide a motivation, and it can also feed the belief that alcohol will reduce our physical pain. So if someone is binge drinking and they have suicidal ideations and they think, okay, I can do X, Y, or Z, and it won't hurt as much. So those are things that we get to think about in terms of the relationship with alcohol as a catalyst for suicide. We also know that alcohol restricts our cognition, and it also, when we're loaded, we cannot necessarily work our alternative coping strategies, our safety plans, the things that we work on in early recovery. So this is why alcohol is deemed as a huge catalyst for suicide. In my experience, in my lived experience, and in my practice as a clinician over these many years, I know that alcohol education equals suicide prevention. And 22% of all suicides involve alcohol intoxication, meaning above the legal limit. And also, suicide is the leading cause of death among those with alcohol use disorder. I wanted to just bring up something with Anthony Bourdain, very charming, successful man. And this is something that I pulled out of Psychology Today. It's a quote from 2014. Drinking. Bourdain still drinks and sometimes confesses to drinking too much, but that's rare. He's usually shown casually drinking a beer or wine with dinner. Bourdain is not a 12-step abstinence automat. He has a good life and he knows how to keep it. Smart, thoughtful people often arrive at such a point, even after some serious detours. I'm going to call BS on this. And I can tell you some stories. One is my favorite. I had a woman that was my patient in a treatment center 15 years ago, and she suffered from opioid use disorder. She shot heroin. She was able to enter recovery. She had a very successful treatment episode. She came to work with us after a year. She was a tech. Talk about living her best life, loved her life, and was extremely recovery oriented. She went to Italy with her husband to celebrate an anniversary, and they were going to go to Tuscany. We all told her, you can't drink. This is not the sort of thing that you want to mess with. You know, your sobriety is working for you. What did she end up doing? She ended up going through a wine tasting. Within 6 months, she was blind drunk, drinking vodka every day. We could not obviously keep her working with us, and ended up going back to heroin, and she died by suicide. And so I'm going to challenge the narrative that one can still drink and drink responsibly in recovery. So let's talk about drug addiction for a moment, as compelling as alcohol use disorder. And it's the same sort of thing. We have the polysubstance, opioid, and also cocaine dependence, where we see an increase in suicidal ideation. And then there's also the notion of overdose, obviously, and is that intentional, unintentional? We simply don't know. Chris Cornell is another individual who was in recovery, and he was prescribed benzos for a shoulder surgery. And his wife will say that this definitely changed him. And again, this reinforces the need to be rigorously honest and to work closely with our medical providers when we have to have some sort of medication, a surgery, something like that. And so again, he died by suicide as well after a relapse after a shoulder surgery. Then we have co-occurring and physical disorders, and we have major depressive disorders, bipolar disorders, hormonal disorders, and then neurological disorders, Lewy body dementia. Now, we know that Robin Williams is someone that I spoke of earlier, where he had a myriad of things going on, and he was in recovery from cocaine addiction, I believe also alcohol. And then he also struggled with depression, some thought bipolar disorder. But in the end of his life, he was diagnosed with the neurological disease. And so he died by suicide after that devastating diagnosis and with struggling with some of the symptoms of that. The reason I bring all of that up is that it's so important that we understand humans as multifaceted and multi-layered in a very holistic sense. We don't know what's going on with someone physically that's feeding their symptoms and feeding their depression and feeding them turning to some sort of drug or alcohol as a coping strategy. So it's very important that we understand people in the holistic way. So co-occurring mental illness, and this is something that in our primary mental health program at Recovery Ways, we really we stress the importance of understanding trauma and post-traumatic stress. We know with our veterans, 20 to 22 die by suicide daily, and we're seeing similar things with first responders. So it's really interesting that when people will come in and they don't necessarily want to talk about use of alcohol or drugs as a maladaptive coping strategy, but they are game to talk about their post-traumatic stress. So we find that that's often a way to engage someone in treatment, because isn't that what it's all about? You know, when I talked about the 1.4 million people with suicide attempts, how do we get to them? How do we speak in such a way that they'll say, yeah, me too, and I want to get help? And so what we found is we have a trauma intensive, and that's very appealing to folks, to our veterans, to our first responders, and they'll be more inclined to come into enroll in that sort of program and then have a look at their maladaptive coping strategies, be it drugs or alcohol, and then going beyond the 2 weeks and being able to engage in their treatment more wholly. So these are some of the things that we see in co-occurring mental illness. Chester Bennington was someone that died by suicide, and he was a very vocal advocate about his abusive childhood. And so with trauma, you know, there was a time in my practice where when I thought of trauma, I thought of our veterans and our first responders. And yes, that's all very relevant. And we have individuals that have childhood trauma that is really impacting their ability to function in their daily lives. We're going to talk about adverse childhood experiences and how those are impacting us in our day-to-day lives. But being able to look at childhood trauma as a reality and how it impacts people in early recovery, how it impacts people who are still perhaps using, and how it will feed suicidal ideations and attempts. That's something that's really important to understand. And this individual, Chester Bennington, was always extremely vocal and honest about his abusive childhood and how it impacted his ability to function. Perfectly hidden depression. This is something that I have a black belt in, and this is something that we're seeing more and more now. And there's a lot of characteristics of someone with perfectly hidden depression. And we really hammer on this. I do a lot of talking, as I mentioned, in with our union employees and in various different professionals programs and things. So important to understand perfectly hidden depression. And with the gentleman that we just lost, I understand that that's something that we're saying that he struggled with, and he had seemingly have it all, the perfect family, the perfect this, the perfect that. And we know no one has the perfect life. And there are things that people struggle with silently and overcompensate in other areas. So to understand perfectly hidden depression, there's a lot of great research on it, and to really keep an eye on not just our loved ones, but ourselves. The perfectionism with the constantly critical inner voice, the intense focus on tasks, using accomplishments as a way to feel valuable, as a way to feel good enough, just minimizing the past. The abuses wasn't that bad. Look at everyone else has it so much worse than I do. And then a strong belief in counting your blessings, being grateful, but keeping everyone at a distance. That intimacy is tough, because if anyone gets close, what are they going to see? That you may not be so perfect, and that you may really feel dark at times. This Chesley Chris, this was heartbreaking. She was a former Miss USA that died by suicide, and she had struggled with perfectly hidden depression. She was an attorney. She led what anyone would view as a perfect life. And she was dealing with a high functioning depression that she hid from absolutely everyone. And her mom was someone who, she gave this quote, Chesley led both a public and private life. In her private life, she was dealing with high functioning depression, which she hid from everyone, including me, her closest confidant, until very shortly before her death. People with perfectly hidden depression will drop out of sight. And it becomes a similar coping strategy to even a binge drinking episode, where you won't hear from someone for a week. You won't hear from someone for 4 to 5 days. And this is where it's so important that we understand this in ourselves and in those we care about in our professional circles, so that we can reach out and we can be a support, so we don't have more tragedies like this beautiful person. All right. So what do we do about this? In 2018, I was introduced to a psychologist work. His name was Thomas Joyner. His name is Thomas Joyner. And I read his book, Why People Die by Suicide, and it changed my life. It changed the way that I view suicide. It changed the way that I treated suicide. It changed the way that we assessed for suicide. It was so meaningful. So I became, I'm not going to lie, a little fangirl about this guy. And I invited him to come to Arizona, where I live and practice, and to ask him to do CEU events for clinicians in Arizona. And so we had Phoenix, we had Tucson, we had hundreds of people coming to hear his work. And it was so compelling. I just finished another one of his books, The Myths of Suicide. And so I wanted to just break this down for you and give you some additional tools, and to highly recommend Thomas Joyner's work. So here's a theory. It's called the interpersonal theory of suicide. And in a nutshell, we have the circle on the left. Thwarted belongingness is a huge, huge feeder to suicidal ideations, a trigger. I am alone. I don't belong. And if we look at the perfectly hidden depression, these are people that can fit in anywhere. They feel like they belong nowhere. So that thwarted belongingness. Also perceived burdensome. I am a burden. That's why we see so many more people that die by suicides and suicide completions in our seniors. They've lost their purpose. They've lost their identity. Perhaps they're ill. They have pain. So the perceived burdensomeness. And then we have the other one, which is the capability of suicide. And I'm going to talk about this. How does one become capable of ending their own life? Then we have the desire for suicide. And if our statistics from 2021 are accurate, we know that there's a lot of folks out there that have expressed a desire for suicide. However, then we look at the capability, the desire, the thwarted belongingness, the perceived burdenness, and then do we have the lethality for suicide attempts? Do we have that capability? And do we have the means, which is very important to understand as well. So here are the here are the factors that contribute to the Joyner research, and there are things that they're in the model. When one feels like they're a burden, when one feels like they can't belong or don't belong, when one has a history of impulsivity, or if one is has a pattern of being impulsive when one is under the influence, childhood abuse, we talked about that, lethal self-injury, and genetic impact. So let's break these down a bit. So burdensome and belongingness. As human beings, we have a need to connect. We have a need to belong. We have a need to feel like we're effective, we're competent, we're contributing. And during COVID, people, boom, that was shut off. Things where we belong, our places of worship, our book clubs, our work. Those are things where people belong and they need that. And one loses that. When one loses the ability in our most basic wiring to be tribal, that can create an extreme risk factor. And so those are things that, we saw really fed by the isolation of COVID. I remember sitting when we first, in 2020, when people first started to have to work from home, I would have people come into the treatment center where I worked and beg me in tears, don't make me work from home. This place keeps me alive. It feeds my soul. And so again, we can all create places to belong so that one doesn't feel like they're a burden and isolated. So Kate Spade is another person that died by suicide while under the influence of alcohol. And she was someone who felt she had sold her company, she was getting divorced, and she felt as though she was really not belonging, and she wasn't a fan of social media. There were a lot of things in her life that were not working, and she felt as though she was outside of her own life, and she died by suicide while under the influence of alcohol. Lethal self-injury. This is something else that I learned through Dr. Joyner, and this is something that we can screen for. And this is something that no matter where I'm working, we add to the admissions assessment to understand what someone's history is of lethal self-injury. Why does it matter? As humans, our most basic instinct is self-preservation. If someone punches you in the face, you go like this. And when these are thwarted, and we know now that cutting, self-harm, all of those things are they're on the rise. And so what we see is that if someone has lost the ability to protect themselves, if they become more and more comfortable with self-harm, if their cutting attempts become more serious, then these are things we get to be aware of and to screen for, so we know what to do, because one can habituate to these behaviors where they're not only are they tolerant of pain, but they're fearless and they become quite comfortable with their own demise. And so that's why in that model, when we look at the capacity for lethal self-injury, these are things that we get to be very mindful of. Provocative experiences was interesting too, the high risk behaviors. And I know that we have a lot of adrenaline junkies out there, and especially in early recovery, when someone loses the rush associated with a variety of things. However, someone with a history of provocative experiences is very important that we understand. Firearms. So again, we look at that model and we look at lethality. Half of all completed suicides happen with firearms. And in the case of using a firearm, 85% of them end in death. What we saw during the pandemic is that people were ordering guns. There were a lot more guns that were available. And again, if someone is loaded, home and isolated, and they have a gun, it's scary, scary stuff. Dear Naomi Judd struggled for decades with treatment-resistant depression. She had a heinous childhood, and it was very vocal about her mental illness, yet she had a firearm in her house. And so the first thing that I will ask someone when they talk about suicidal ideations, please remove any guns from your house, any firearms. And so something else to just think about in terms of how we work with our patients and family members too. So impulsivity as a factor in suicide, there's a strong indication that impulsivity plays a significant role. Many suicides appear to be spur of the moment, and someone will tell you after surviving, there's so much interesting research, and Dr. Joyner's done a lot of it. People that jump off the Golden Gate Bridge, if someone survives, they report being extremely grateful. And so what are some impulsivities other than, of course, we've talked significantly about alcohol and impulsivity, but think about daredevil behaviors, reckless driving, theft, impulsive spending, and primal humiliation. Again, those are things that are to be very, that we get to screen for. And, there's theories of spur of the minute suicides, that those happen more obviously when people are under the influence, but that's where we reduce the risk factors by reducing means that are around someone. So childhood abuse and trauma. I am sure most of you are familiar with adverse childhood experiences, but we know that for someone that's had childhood abuse and trauma, multiple attempts risk 8 times greater for sexual abuse, physical and sexual abuse, higher risk for lethal self-injury. And when children are abused, when children have trauma, their attachment template may be compromised, and also their nervous system dysregulated without necessarily the ability to calm and to soothe. So there is a relationship, as we've mentioned, between early childhood trauma and well-being problems later in life. And so if we look at adverse childhood experiences and we have social and emotional cognitive impairment, adoption of high health risk, high risk behavior, disease, disability, and early death. So these are things that I believe very strongly in screening for with our patients. It's really interesting. So many people, you'll say, so, tell me about your childhood. Oh, it was great. I haven't had any trauma. And then when we dig in, we find that their adverse childhood experience scores are off the chart, and they don't even realize it or embrace it or acknowledge it, setting themselves up for a lot of issues. So what stops people from getting help? That 1.4 million, what prevents them from getting help? A lot of it is stigma. And if there's one thing that's been a COVID benefit, I would say that the stigma around suicide and mental illness is something that has been reduced. So what stops people from getting help? There's this judgment, as I've been mentioning, with working with large employer groups. There's so many employer groups where if one admits that they have struggles with depression, God forbid, suicidal ideations, they can lose their jobs, they can lose their licenses. And so it's a high risk strategy for someone to say that they're feeling suicidal ideations. So there's also the historical view. There's such a historical stigma around suicide. And there was a time where folks that are die by suicide can't be buried in Catholic cemeteries. They don't deserve funerals. And also there won't be any life insurance paid out to survivors. So when one dies by suicide, their legacy can be shattered, leaving their family members without a proper way to grieve, without any without any permission, if you will, to establish a legacy for their loved one. So there are certain myths out there that feed stigma. And I want to review these just to be sure that these are things that are top of mind, that mentioning suicide could put the idea in someone's head. The truth of the matter is, talking about suicide does not increase the risk. Suicide is due to personal weakness or flaws. The truth is contemplating suicide is no reflection on one's character. It's a multi-layered and very complex mental health and also physical health condition. There's nothing you can do if someone wants to die. People that struggle with suicidal ideations really don't necessarily want to die. They want the pain to stop. And suicide is a selfish act. Those who attempt suicide feel that the world is better off without them, that they are a burden. So risk factors and warning signs. This is something that's very important that we understand. Risk factors and warning signs are very different. Risk factors, they indicate that someone's more likely to consider, attempt, or die by suicide, but it doesn't mean anything about imminent danger. Warning signs, on the other hand, they indicate that there's an immediate risk, and they're especially concerning if they're new, they've increased, or are related to one of the things that we've recently talked about, an event, a loss, a change, those kinds of things. And so to understand the difference is important to us. So what are risk factors? The research shows us that a prior suicide attempt is the strongest risk factor. Now, when we screen, it's important to understand the number of prior suicide attempts and the lethality. The other thing that's really important to note is that people who are really struggling with suicidal ideations will minimize their prior suicide attempts. So we get to be skillful in teasing out what was the attempt, was one under the influence, what was the situation surrounding it, and what was the lethality. And the more that we dig and the more that we express empathy and support in the process, because there's so much shame around it, that's the only way that we're going to get an accurate read on the number of suicide attempts. Family history of suicide. The research shows that this is a huge risk factor. And that's because of all the things, forget about the whether mental illness is hereditary or substance use disorder. Think about the shame associated with a loved one dying by suicide, the lack of legacy that they're allowed to create, and the grief surrounding it. And so family history is very important. And please dig into a couple generations back, grandpas, grandmas, those kinds of things. Trauma, huge, as we've talked about, substance use disorder, alcohol and drugs, and also the mood disorders that we know are very high risk factors. Other things, and we've touched on some of these, relationship disruption. Folks with alcohol use disorder, they report major relationship disruptions within the 6 months prior to a suicide attempt. The numbers are overwhelming. Between 60 and 80% will report that they had a major relationship disruption, job or financial loss that obviously feeds the feeling like a burden, belonging, social supports, impulsivity. What are things that someone has in their history that reflect impulsive behavior, aggression, anger, the cutting that we've talked about, any other form of lethal self-injury? And also, are there any social contagions that have gone on in their past, in their groups? And then also, again, humiliation. I just can't stress that enough. And to also look at social media and what someone has experienced on social media. So, warning signs. These are something to show we've got to jump into action. It's a call to action. Talking about wanting to die, withdrawing from life, talking about being a burden. That sudden lift in mood with no change in circumstance, we call that false sense of recovery. And this is real. This is something where someone has come to terms with the end of their life. They know what they're going to do. They know how they're going to do it. And there's a certain calm. And so again, if there's someone in your world that has a lot of things going on, but all of a sudden there's this false sense of recovery, that's real and it's a warning sign. And then also buying a firearm or accessing other means pills, it's a call to action. So in addition to all these risk factors and warning signs, there's also protective factors, because remember, the most basic instinct is self-preservation. I'm a huge fan of the Columbia Suicide Risk Assessment model, and that not only looks at one's relationship with suicide over time, short-term and long-term, but it also looks at protective factors. And this is something at Recovery Ways that we have built into our electronic health record, and we screen for this at every week to know how are we doing with, not only are you building your protective factors, but are you allowing yourself to think about them? Because as we know, when we're struggling with depression, when we're struggling with substance use disorder, it's very hard to see a protective factor, and it might be right in front of us. Our resilience, the fact that someone is getting care, the fact that someone is choosing life even for just that moment, we can really build on that as a protective factor. Employment, we can all create protective environments in our lives with our places of employment. Does someone have a religious or spiritual belief? Do they believe in something outside or larger than themselves? So these are the things that we look at and we screen for. And if there's any of them, we take it and run. If they aren't there, we work on building them. So protective factors are very important as well. So I wanted to give some tools in terms of what can we do and how do we talk with ourselves? How do we talk with others? So if one is feeling as though they're a burden, if someone feels like they don't belong, and so ask yourself, is my judgment clouded in any way? Is there something that's going on right now? Either of, the old in recovery, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, those always fit. Is one intoxicated? Is there anything that's going on to cloud judgment? And then that resilience. What has kept me alive to this point? What can I celebrate? How have I shown up for myself? And what has kept me alive to this point? Then my personal favorite is the story I'm telling myself true. As we get into morbid reflection and we focus on the negative, we can tell ourselves some real tall tales and to challenge ourselves. Is this story I'm telling myself true? This one's a little harder. What am I getting out of this? Is there a secondary gain to my staying in my house for 5 days beneath my blankets? Am I getting something out of this? And what can I do to provide comfort, to know ourselves? This week, one of the docs we work with and I did a holiday depression we've been doing this for years, holiday blues, and I can tell you, being able to know yourself well enough to know what can I do in this moment to provide myself some comfort. And so those are things to ask yourself. To others, are you thinking of ending your life? Don't beat around the bush. As we mentioned in the myths, bringing up suicide is not a bad thing. It's a good thing. Ask them straight up. Are you thinking of ending your life? Do you have a firearm? What are you willing to do to stay alive right now? And are you open to me or someone else staying with you until we find you some help? These are things that I mentioned very early on, that I had an employee come in with ligature marks around his neck. And these are things that I immediately implemented, and believe me, kept him in my office until we could get him the help he needed, but never, ever leave the individual alone or allow them to minimize it. When there is a loss, how do we help? What do we do? No inquiry about warning signs or circumstances. And this might seem like such a no-brainer, but sometimes I've heard people ask really judgmental questions. Did you see this coming? You know, what happened? Those kinds of things. So avoid anything that the survivor could view as blaming or shaming. Show empathy. Be present for months and years to come. You know, one of my dearest friends lost her only son to suicide 12 years ago, and the pain really doesn't go away. She's found a way to integrate it into her life and find purpose. But, you know, I never forget his birthday, his anniversaries. Be very sure to be present for months and years to come. The other thing is, don't wait to be asked to help. Think of anything and do it, any positive show of support. And please don't ever tell someone that it's going to be okay, or say, I know how you feel, because we necessarily don't know that. We have started at Recovery Ways a virtual support group, and we'll make sure when this PowerPoint comes out that that everyone has that resource. It's every other week, and it's for anyone that's lost a loved one to a suicide or overdose. And it's a no-cost virtual program that, not a program, but it's a support group. So anyone is welcome to join. The other thing I wanted to be sure that we know, there's support groups out there. There's the support group I just talked about, but EAPs are available. Family members are eligible for insurance. There's virtual care, and there's more and more IOPs, day treatment, residential, popping up for people with mental health primary. The other thing that I really have seen is that treatment centers that specialize in substance use disorder aren't necessarily shying away from folks with suicide attempts, because they know that if they are turned away, there's nowhere to go. And so I've seen people do a really good job of educating themselves, and to be sure that they have mental health counselors on staff that can treat the folks, that not only just in residential, but remember, when someone is in their first 30 days after getting sober, their risk goes up for suicide. So we've got to be able to have the resources to support that. There's also the 988, I'm sure you know that, and it's a wonderful thing. It's the rollout in some states is it's real. Check it out in your state. And there's also the Zero Suicide movement, and I will add that it's something that I'm very active in, and I get their listserv, and it's just a wealth of information. There's toolkits, and it's just wonderful. So there are resources out there, and those are the resources that I've utilized in this. So I really thank you so very much for attending, and also thank you for the work that you do. Now let's talk about some questions. Do we have time for questions, or do we have some questions out there?
We do have a question. Let me pull it up, Jamie. Faith B is asking if she can get a link to the research on tag contagions and
Absolutely.
clusters
Absolutely.
Okay. Any more questions? Do you see any studies around attachment type and suicide?
Yes. And I have a whole part of this presentation that I didn't do today because these presentations, I have different components, and there's one all on attachment that I can send to you.
Also asks, do you guys work with people in Nevada?
We do.
And this is a comment that was made a little bit ago by Lori. We need residential in Nevada for mental health. There is none, and insurance really gets in the way when going to other states out of Nevada. I've heard that before as well. is also asking, what is your holiday offer post I saw?
Oh, so what that is we are primarily at Recovery Ways, we are primarily for folks that are insurance dependent, and that you can go to Recovery Ways and not be hit with, a huge, okay, that will be an additional $10,000 or something like that. So, what we have decided to do is we are offering a self-pay promotion where it's significantly discounted, either if someone doesn't have insurance or they don't want to use their insurance for whatever reason, we are discounting the entire treatment episode significantly. And then if someone completes the 45 days of care, then we're offering IOP, virtual or live, at no cost. It's our gift to the community to say, you know what, let's all get behind recovery and offer it to anyone.
Thank you, Jamie. Robin Odell is saying, I want to say I have a current client that the biggest risk factor that has driven his SI is legal issues. I think that is important to also assess for.
Absolutely.
How might we expect our 1 hour certificate? I think that'll be sent in the follow-up email, if I'm not mistaken, Katie. Are we able to get a transcript or recording to share with others? Yeah, so Faith, we will be sending a recording with all of this, this whole CEU event after we get off here. And that will go out to everyone. Here's a good one. Oh, sorry, Jamie, go ahead.
I think I just saw that question.
Okay.
What if someone has a lot of risk
Yeah.
factors but no warning signs? Watch them like a hawk. Be sure that they are involved in building those protective factors, and so that the risk factors don't turn into warning signs, or they're not just minimizing the warning signs.
Yeah, that's a good point too. It's been brought up here in Montana a few times with the veteran population that there won't be any warning signs, but
That's right.
they'll sell their house out of nowhere. They'll give away their car and all the money for their house, things like that, where it's like an act of good faith or like they owe something to their family or friends.
Those
And
are warning
then,
signs.
yeah. Okay, are there any other questions?
All right. Thank you all so much for being here, and have a wonderful holiday, and thanks for the work you do.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Bye-bye.